Farrah Storr, thank you so much for joining us today for our edition of Limitless.
Welcome, nice to be here.
Farrah, I've been looking at your career history and it is very, very impressive. I'm really curious to know what brought you into the world of media.
Well, it was a kind of circuitous route, if I'm honest, because, look, I grew up in Manchester, I grew up in Salford, and had a kind of very classical, and I say this with great love and admiration, Asian father who very much wanted all of us to be doctors, engineers, or a lawyer, and everything else was failure. And so media, it just really wasn't a thing, and I actually didn't know that there were jobs in media. My elder sister, she was the kind of dutiful elder daughter. She became a lawyer, and then she entered a competition in a magazine, which was, I think it was like data male model, and you won work experience. And I remember my sister, she came down to London, she was living in Manchester. She came back and she said to me, it is a different world. There are people that have jobs on these magazines, and I loved magazines. And it kind of opened up the world to me. And so what I did was I was like, well, I have to be in London, rightly or wrongly, because there are challenges about the media being down here, but I knew I had to be in London if I wanted to be in the media. And so actually got rejected from Oxford, and then very much made a strategic decision to go to a London university, and basically did work experience through my entire time at uni, so that by the time I came out, I would have a job.
Wonderful. So, so you did consider following Dad's advice, because you did apply to Oxford.
Do you know what? It very much came from me. It was. I think there was obviously, look, you want to please your father, and I was devastated when I didn't get in. It was one of those hard knocks early on in life, which really floored me, and it was brilliant actually that I learned that failure early on. But yeah, I think, look, my sister had done the hard yard. She tried law, and then it kind of opened up the pathway for me to actually, you know what, there is potential, and there is a really interesting career to be had from a career in the media.
So what was the first role?
So my first role was I was a features assistant on a magazine called Woman and Home. So look, it wasn't my dream job. I would much rather have worked on Elle or Cosmo. The age range was much older, but it was a brilliant kind of training ground for me, and I really got to understand women actually doing that job. They were all kind of my mother's age, but it was a seminal role for me, and I had many, I was very, very happy there. And after that I moved to Good Housekeeping, and after that Glamour. So I kind of got younger and younger. The more older I got, the younger the demographic that I started to write for was.
So it's interesting that you sort of learned your craft on some of the more established magazines, and then went to be positioned in some of the more radical magazines.
That's right.
It sounds like you're smiling as if it's been quite an exciting time. So I think many young girls are hugely influenced by what they see in the media and what they see in magazines, and it's not just younger girls, it's older girls as well, and representation is important. You touched on being in Manchester and having to come to London. Do you think that magazines and publishing have a role to play in fairly representing society?
Absolutely. I mean, the media more than anyone. I always worry, and I say this to everyone actually, I worry that the media is becoming more and more enclosed. There is nothing wrong, but because of our geographical location, I worry we don't speak to the entire country. I'm not saying anything new, but it's kind of famous that actually in the media, people do work experience, jobs are scarce. So what happens is you actually only attract a certain type of individual, so largely middle class or those from the southeast. Again, nothing wrong with that. But you start to have, you don't have full representation. That there are so many divergent voices across the country, and I don't think we are fully representing all of them. And that's something that the media has got to tackle.
It's interesting you talk about sort of the middle classes in the south and the suburbs being more prolific within media. Do you think that unpaid internships have had any impact on that? Because certainly look at the north-south divide. I know that social mobility is a strong passion of yours.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's probably why I became a social mobility commissioner, was because, look, I had to go through the whole unpaid work experience system. I'm really lucky, and actually the company I work for does not do that. And actually, when I was at Cosmopolitan, later on in my career, we worked really hard to get scholarships. And those scholarships were not just were not just come down and we'll pay for your accommodation. We had to think about everything. Groceries, could people afford a coffee when they got down here? Accommodation, yes. Travel. So it's a real problem. And I think, I've always been aware of it because of where I came from. There are not a lot of people from Salford, although the BBC is there now, who are represented in the media, particularly in women's magazines. But I think it's changing. And I think the unpaid intern system, which, fortunately has kind of been eradicated now, that was one of the kind of gates, that was the drawbridge saying to a certain demographic, this is maybe not for you because you can't do it.
It's interesting. So we're through Limitless, we've been exploring lots of different sectors, and frequently we identify that gender is a barrier.
Right.
Females are frequently blocked, consciously or otherwise, from moving into certain careers. Actually, what perhaps you're identifying in media is it may not be gender, but it certainly could be social mobility. Now, you touched on Cosmopolitan. It's sort of the elephant in the room, and I think anyone of my generation, can remember from very basic magazines that give us advice on the latest colour and trends. And I'm going back to an era where Twilight Teaser was right. The colour of choice for everybody, irrespective of our skin colour and hair colour, etc. And then Cosmopolitan burst on our scenes right. and sort of empowered women and emancipated women to be able to feel empowered and take control of their own money, their own earning, their own spending habits, and that sort of the real true influences and the real power of the female pound came out in that magazine. How liberating was that for you? And just tell us about that story.
So the story of me taking on Cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
So it was interesting because you're absolutely right. I mean, actually, I grew up with Cosmo at an interesting time. So I grew up with Cosmo in the 90s. And by the 90s, you quite correctly identified Cosmo was always about money and about earning your own money. And because of that, actually, what happened is women then were like, well, I can earn money like a man. I can have sex like a man as well. By the 90s, it was mainly known for sex. So it was quite interesting. So it was very emancipating in that it talked about sex all the time. I grew up where it was kind of about sex positions and, 101 ways to whatever. But actually what happened, by the time I reached Cosmo, which was 2015, I was asked to do a kind of, it wasn't quite a rebrand, but I was really told, look, can you look at this brand? Because actually at that point we hadn't been the number one young women's magazine for, I think it was about 17 years. And there was a feeling that we weren't engaging with the younger generation of women. Anyone over kind of 30 got Cosmo, but anyone younger, it just didn't really have a place for them. And so my job was, how do you re-engage that audience while still keeping in the fold everybody else who felt loyal to Cosmo? And it was really difficult because, how do you reimagine a heritage brand when everything that made it famous, so its naked centerfolds, its agony aunt columns, were actually, by the time I got there, were actually the things which were making it dated. And actually, because the generation that actually I needed to speak to, which was millennials actually when I joined Cosmo, but also a bit of Gen Z, the culture had changed drastically. And actually, I had to think about, well, is there a place for having a naked centerfold of a man, of objectifying men, which we were all told, you can absolutely do that. Younger generation did not feel the same. And so we had to actually forsake a lot of the sacred cows that had made us famous. My job was very much to look at, well, how do we look at emancipation for women today? And so actually what we did is a couple of things. We went big on how to be a self-made woman, the whole era of hustling, people being highly individual, only themselves to look after. We looked at sex through a different lens. We looked at sex through how was the world having sex. So Tinder had revolutionized everything. So we did long-form journalism about sex. And I also felt that we had an opportunity to have divergent conversations. When I grew up, when I became a journalist, every magazine that I joined, you were told you had to speak in the language and the tone. Every magazine had its own voice, and you had to adhere to that. And I kind of felt actually you need diversity of voices, and actually you need diversity of opinion too. And that's what we did with Cosmo. I never felt that you should turn the page of a magazine and agree with absolutely everything that's in there. I actually thought, particularly for this generation, there's something brilliant about discovering a counter position to what you had thought the world was like, and you having that dialogue with yourself. And so that's what we did. And we had a lot of success with it. I mean, look, we had a lot of pushback to what we did, but we grew hugely. We grew by 49% in a year, and we went back to being the number one young women's mag.
It's interesting that you identify very strongly that, Cosmo, when it was appealing to one generation, probably my generation, Gen X, I have to think about it. But, we were brought up in the era of because you're worth it.
Right.
That became a very strong strapline and a very strong mantra for and representative of that generation. You're quite right. And the generation that has come next is because we value it. Yeah. And that psyche change is quite important. But that revolutionary change also coincided with technology change. Right. And there certainly was, I anticipate, an anxiety of readership dropping off because it was old format. Totally. Print media moving, and you said that branching into that long journalism, completely changing the narrative and creating a discussion. Talk us through about the revolution of digitalisation on Cosmo and other publications of that similar nature.
Well, you're absolutely right, on every publication. I mean, I became an editor. I've been a journalist 20 years, but 10 of those years, half of my career has been as an editor. And I became an editor of a magazine called Women's Health in 2012. 2012 was a kind of cataclysmic year for magazines because you're right, it was a digital revolution, and people were like, well, if you can get anything you want and you can get it for free and it's living in your pocket, why would you wait a month to get something? Why would you go to the newsstand? And do people actually still want to read the printed word? And so I've always, and I think it's why actually I've become so interested with the power of constraint and discomfort. I've always had I've always had to power through businesses during a very, very difficult time, and you're right, it's the kind of digital revolution. I'm now at Elle, I'm over digital and I'm over print, and actually, people go, well, print, will it be forever? Certain brands will be forever, they absolutely will be. A lot of them have dropped off, but the interesting thing I was saying to somebody the other day is, I remember when I joined Cosmo, and I turned to the magazine, and the magazine, rightly or wrongly actually, because none of us knew at the time, we had no long form, it was all kind of chunk copy. And I remember saying to someone, can you talk to me about this? And they were like, well, the digital revolution's coming, people are getting used to digital, so we need to do the same thing in print. And I was like, you absolutely don't. You have to become printier. You have to kind of do the opposite, because you're the same brand, but you're a completely different platform with a different offering. And probably, we didn't know this at the time, we do now, probably a different audience. So it's been really hard. And there's been a lot of casualties along the way. Magazines I work for, Eve magazine, magazines I grew up with, just 17. And I can't tell you whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, to be honest with you. I mean, look, people have access to more information than ever before. So I grew up with just 17. Kids now, they grow up with YouTube. They have all different sorts of voices. But I suppose the question is are they the right voices that a younger generation are listening to?
So with the emergence of digital, as you've highlighted there, I'm curious to understand your view on what the future of, I suppose, glossy magazines and its where it continues to find its purpose in the era now of everyone's a publisher. Well, everyone can generate its own content, and that Instagram and other platforms, as you've referenced, hugely pivotal in that. Is there still a role for magazines of that nature?
Yeah, I think there is. I think, you're right, everybody is a content creator now. And I think a couple of years ago, that was a real worry. It was like, well, everybody is creating content, so how do we stand out? What we did, Cosmo was a really good example, because actually what I said to the team was, I said, well, you've got to look at this as a positive, which is, okay, everybody creates content now, and most of it is free. So what you have to do is you have to be undeniable. You have to find stories that nobody else is publishing. And once upon a time when I was a journalist, how we found stories was you would look in the newspapers and you would see little things and you would go, oh, that's an interesting idea. That wasn't an option anymore. And so what I said to my team was, you should probably use digital to your advantage. And actually social media, which we thought was kind of the death knell for magazines, actually has been amazing, because at Cosmo in particular, and a little bit at Elle actually, it gives you access to the cultural ether. You see people laid bare. You can pick up your phone and you can start to notice patterns in culture. And the whole point of journalism, I think, and good journalists, is we have to investigate the world around us. Now, before digital, we could only kind of investigate the world by, finding case studies, listening to our friends, reading the newspapers. Now the world is our oyster, and good journalists, they kind of lean into digital and they look for these patterns, and then they produce them as these kind of long form stories. And I think that is one of the reasons we had a lot of success with Cosmo. So they can work together, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
It's a wonderful irony that what was potentially to your point, the death knell of media has actually become potentially its salvation, because it is technology has enabled media to find those emergent trends, those emergent stories, those emergent fashions, those emergent, whether it's political or whatever underground movement is happening, there's usually something sprouts from that.
Totally. You're absolutely right. It is probably, I think, the best thing if your journalists are behaving in the right way and they know how to deal with it, if they don't see it as a threat and they see it as an opportunity actually to bolster what they're doing. So, look, I love being over digital, I love being over print. The two are very different, but the two can also work together, and you get to reach, much bigger audiences as well. And if the content you are doing is worth it, and if the content is different, I think that's the other thing is, I think one of the things that I always get called controversial, and actually I would like to think I'm not controversial, but what I do like doing is, if the world is telling this story, and the world at the moment, a lot of people are afraid of having opinions. We know there's a lot of groupthink, people thinking the same thing publicly. I always say to my team, what's the other side of the story? And what you have to do is you have to present both sides, or multiple sides sometimes, and then let the world decide. And I do think a lot of media is very scared to represent everything. And I think it is our duty actually, is to have divergent, not just voices, but points of view.
It's refreshing to hear that what was once glossy magazines positioning everything you needed to buy is actually now becoming an authority of actually this is something you probably need to hear.
That's right. That's right.
Very different. Farrah, what advice would you give your 20-year-old self?
Oh, well, I still am. You don't change a huge amount. I'm still very introverted, I'm naturally a very quiet person. But I would say I was quite fragile when I was 20. And I think I was quite scared of the world around me, if I'm completely honest. I didn't approach obstacles, I swerved them. I was petrified of failure, which is why, failing at Oxford was a really good knock for me. I think what I would say is, it's really important actually to acknowledge that challenge, and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable is actually how you unlock your true potential. So I think it's the best advice that I could give to quite a meek and mild 20-year-old to help her soar forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that insightful information.
Welcome.
Appreciate that, Farrah.